So we're very happy to be joined by Dr. Bernd Rosslenbroich from Witten Herdecke University in Germany. Dr. Rosslenbroich is head of the Institute of Evolutionary Biology and Morphology at Witten Herdecke University. His research interests are patterns and process in macroevolution, organismic and systems biology, and philosophy of biology and medicine. Author of On the Origin of Autonomy, a new look at the major transitions in evolution, Springer 2014, and properties of life towards a theory of organismic biology from MIT Press just last year in 2023. He'll be speaking on properties of life, a proposal for an integrative concept. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, thank you for your invitation. When we see an animal or a plant, we immediately perceive something about it, that it is alive, so that it is a living system. It's being alive, we experience at once, in some sense. And we experience that there is something different than getting a stone in our hand, for example. And in our daily dealings, this is very clear, but in science, that has not been easy to figure out what really the difference is and what the characteristics of living is. And of course, this is a very long discussion. And finally, this topic has been a topic for centuries in biology. Most well-known, of course, is the contrast between mechanistic thinking on the one hand and vitalism on the other. But what is much less known or even ignored somehow is that there have been attempts in science to develop an approach between these extremes, so to say. They are usually summarized as organismic biology or organicism. This began around the 1920s and tried to identify central characters of organisms and to avoid the usual reductionistic stance and the explanations in mechanisms. To these beginnings of this movement belong, for example, there are many people who need to be mentioned, but for example, just to mention one example, is the Theoretical Biology Club of the 1920s at Cambridge University. They somehow tried to come to a new conclusion besides the traps of mechanistic thinking on the one hand and vitalistic thinking on the other. However, all this movement was very diverse and never reached a unified concept. It is basically aware of what has been learned by modern science and takes it serious, of course, but it calls for an integration, a new sort of integration for a more appropriate attempt. And the interesting thing is that now with the 21st century, there are new considerations in organismic thinking, and there are several people thinking along these lines of thought, again integrating what modern science has to say about life, but integrating it in some new synthesis. Let me just show 3 examples out of a rich literature in this direction. Carl Woese is a leading microbiologist in the US, and he published a paper with the title A New Biology for a New Century in 2004. And his conclusion is, let's stop looking at the organism purely as a molecular machine. It's a very interesting paper, together with some crucial papers from this time. This pushed another more intention on these organismic principles. The Nobel Prize winner Paul Nurse wrote in Nature, "Biology stands at an interesting juncture. The past decades have seen remarkable advances in our understanding of how living organisms work, but comprehensive understanding of many higher-level biological phenomena remains elusive. An interesting person at time is Dennis Noble. He is a renowned physiologist from Oxford University, and he is vehemently arguing for a new understanding of life, and especially also of evolution. Especially his little book, his small books here on the left side, The Music of Life, is very readable and is quite influential at present. However, only certain cycles are really listening. It is influential, but many biologists just don't listen. At present, there are conferences and meetings, and often these are very interesting and conclusive on the question of a new view on the living. But I think this organismic view has a central problem. There is hardly a coherent concept that gives a new orientation. Discussions of different perspectives and approaches are interesting, but they are hardly organized within a coherent concept. And I think this has advantages on the one hand, but at the same time disadvantages on the other hand. To the advantages, of course, it is that there is a certain pluralism emerging. So it's not, again, a hardening on one theory, on one perspective on life. But on the other hand, a unified theory, or at least an overview on these aspects, would possibly generate more attention within the scientific community. Therefore, I propose a sort of synthesis. It tries to identify and to describe the primary specific properties of life processes and to synthesize them at least within a certain overview. So, my hypothesis is that empirical research has meanwhile developed so far that it has out of itself the material and the preconditions to understand more of the specific properties of the living. Answers to this can be derived from the empirical obtained principles that science has gained so far. One only has to take the results of empirical research really serious in their consequences, and this would generate a new perspective on being alive. Important is that I'm not trying to go to define what is life. As Michael Levin said before, and I think he is right, many people tried to define life, and this has not been conclusive so far. And I'm also not trying to describe the difference between non-living and living, but just trying to take together the specific properties that come out of research when we study organisms. And I think this is more than has just been described by chemistry or physics. So these disciplines do not are not enough to describe the living. The life being alive has an own ontologically own specific entity, and we have to learn about this principle. And I think science is doing this, but it has to take these things serious. So my approach has three intentions. First, to propose a comprehensive concept for organismic biology in form of a synthesis. Second, to argue for an ontologically irreducible concept of the living, in the sense that life is not reducible to physics or chemistry. And third, to develop a background for a more appropriate way of dealing with nature than a mechanistic interpretation can provide. And the essential thing is the proposal to take these properties as starting points for research. So let me present some of these properties. I am going to I'm trying to make this very simple, in just very, very simple and in simple terms and simple explanations, just to have to present the basic idea. So in a really simple manner. The basic method in science is causal analysis, of course. An attempt is made to resolve phenomena into causal chains. When the pioneers of biochemistry began their studies at the beginning of the 20th century, they tended to think in terms of such linear sequences, linear cause and effect chains. The product of one reaction is introduced into the next reaction, and so on. A relationship is considered to be explained when the chains of cause and effect are uncovered. And this was the same when the processes of energy production in a cell were studied. When the chemical components of which are involved in energy production have been studied, they arranged them in such a linear sequence. But then they were faced with the question, I think this was already in the 1950s or somewhere in this time. But when they were first faced with the question of what happens next, they dealt for a long time with this problem. And then it was first theoretically suggested that the last product could be seen as a new starting point for the whole process. At first, this was a speculative suggestion, and it took a lot of time to describe further intermediate steps. But eventually, it became clear that this was a cycle. And of course, this is the famous citric acid cycle. Everybody knows this. And that's how it looks in large parts of biochemistry. When students today learn in their courses, they usually learn about cycles of biochemical processes. One process is dependent on another, or the processes are integrated into a network of other processes. There is no initial cause and there is no final effect. Rather, one process is the condition for the next, which is again the condition for the next, and so on. Such processes are interdependent within cycles or within networks. And this is about a modern representation of these interdependencies after many more factors have been found, and all these descriptions now are more networks that are interdependent and are interrelated, of course. Or depictions like this are more modern to see which components are involved, and thus that these interconnections are the main principle, how these things are organized. And this can be seen today for genetics. Formerly, it was assumed that information always flows in one direction, from DNA to protein and finally to the trait. In the meantime, I'm just making very simple statements for this. It became clear that there are just as many feedback processes, so that one can no longer identify DNA as a kind of first cause. As important as the information of the DNA is, so is the regulation process for handling the DNA within the cell. The one-sided expectation that DNA is a kind of control unit, a kind of first cause within the cell, has not been confirmed. Such interdependencies can now also be described in completely different levels. So I want to call this interdependence that exists at the same time, the principle of concurrency. I tried to describe this in my book as the principle of concurrency, and I think this principle is really an essential one within the organismic process, or understanding organisms as organismic entities. Simple examples, of course, exist from ecology. It is becoming increasingly clear today that we are dealing with interdependent systems and networks, especially in ecology. So an important property, or my first property that I want to mention here, is that living is characterized by interdependencies, by reciprocity and concurrency. Another principle are integrative systems. The system principle is currently quite modern in molecular biology. One has described such an abundance of individual facts that now the question arises how these components interact within a meaningful whole. However, there are two very different versions of understanding systems. One has been called pragmatic systems biology. It uses extensive data sets in order to reconstruct the system context out of these components. But this does not correspond to the first concepts from the 1960s, which attempted to describe integrative functions in the organism. What especially was an organismic approach in that time, and it has followers today, of course. Such an approach can be called integrative systems biology. Here's one such description from the 1960s from a well-known scientist, Paul Weiss. He was a leading figure in science in the 1960s, 70s, and he proposed such a depiction of this. It describes that there are integrated functions and processes in the organism. This approach sees a system as a distinct ontological category. A system is defined as a relatively independent and stable entity. It exerts constraining or regulating functions on its subcomponents. This ensures the functioning of the system as a whole. I think this is a crucial property of any organism, that it is able to integrate functions. And sometimes these principles are called top-down effects as opposed to bottom-up effects. But the essential thing that they are concurrently present, and they interact. Already every cell has to integrate and organize its subcomponents. It is well known today that the cell organizes all its organelles, all its molecular components, including its DNA. But at the same time, a system is not a somehow superordinate entity. That is important. Just as the system integrates its components, the components build up the system. So the mutual interdependence between the parts and the overall system, between molecules and organismal organization, is the principle of a living system. And this altogether is a process. And the challenge is to think this really as an interdependent system. Another property I want to mention within this overview is autonomy. This simply describes a difference of the organism in relation to the environment in a very general sense. So something different happens within the organism than in its inorganic environment, and this differentness is actively maintained. So there is a metabolism that generates an imbalance with respect to the inorganic environment. An energetic gradient to the environment is maintained. Genetic independence, a sort of genetic autonomy, an order, an organization is maintained, and things like this. The living beings delimit themselves from the environment, and thereby acquire new possibilities within this. In some work, I described that these abilities of autonomy can change during the evolution. So there are long-term changes of the ability to generate autonomy to the environment, some being self self-regulating their internal components. Just a very short example, exemplified by the transition from unicellular to cellular to multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms have much more functions to regulate their internal milieu. Thus, they stabilize their self-generated internal functions. Overall, the possibilities within the environment have been extended throughout evolution with much more complex and more regulative organisms. And this is the case in many of the major transitions in evolution. And this is what I mean with the principle of autonomy that can be described throughout evolution. Another property is agency. Agency here means activity, self-activity. It is the overall autonomous activity of the organism to maintain life functions, and then further activities can build on this. Every cell has a continuous activity to maintain basic life functions. What is known as metabolism, protein synthesis, DNA transcription, these are all activities generated by the cell. So an essential point is that life itself is activity, is agency. In animals and humans, there are, of course, circulatory systems, a heart, and all these things. They are activities that make up the living as such. For the moment, this statement may be quite simple or self-evident, but it has far-reaching consequences. The conventional view of the organism localizes the ability that something can be active into the physico-chemical processes. According to this view, events within a cell or an organism are driven by molecular energetic reactions, being the motor of all functions. Thus, the activity is more or less explicitly seen in the metabolic machinery. However, a consequent phenomenological view shows that agency can only come from a whole and intact organism. Minimally, agency needs a functioning cell. Nothing comparable is known from the inorganic realm, or as has been said, is a stone, that's a quotation, is a stone falling down a waterfall really analogous to a salmon leaping up a waterfall? Thus, agency is a primary property of an organism, of organisms in general, but it uses and needs, of course, the metabolism to fuel these activities. And the same is true for genetic information. Genes cannot be active. They are not able to control or even to determine something within the organism, as is often said. Rather, by the activity of the cell, the information content is processed within highly regulated functions. Information can be used in a meaningful way only within the context of the cell's activity, the cell's agency. So we can say a living organism is characterized by active processes. In this sense, an organism is more a process rather than a thing. We summarized this view in our paper on agency we published this year. I published this together with two colleagues. Processing of molecules, of course, is important. Organisms, of course, use and need molecules. In the process, the properties of very specific molecules are used and integrated. This is what biochemistry especially describes in all the details. And which molecules are formed, when they are formed, and to where they are transported is actively organized by the cell or the organism. But at the same time, the characteristics of these molecules are essential. And the same is with information. Likewise, the organism or the cell actively deals with its information. But the cell organizes the DNA, as I said before, for example, which sections are transcribed and when, and even can be quite active, deal quite active with the DNA. And I think that's about what Michael Levin said in his talk about intelligence. So there is some processing of information and some intelligence within the cell, within the organism, that plays a crucial role together with molecules, of course. And the third thing, somehow natural, that's the cell organizes the processing of energy. Energy is organized in smallest units, the ATP, the basic unit of transporting energy, so it can be actively used. It underlies the activity of the cell. In summary, the situation in all organisms is the unresolvable functional relation between this intrinsic activity and molecular, energetic, and informational processes. And this is the concurrency between agency and molecular, energetic, and informational processes. Research can focus on one of these entities and successfully describe, for example, the molecular components which are involved. But then the reintegration into the context is necessary. And this is the point I want to make, that this integration is necessary to come nearer to what an organism really is doing. An agency is generated by this interdependent complex, and it cannot be reduced to one of these. But also, it is not something extra, something behind these three qualities. That's again important. The system is generated by the interaction of its components, and the components are integrated and regulated by the system. Another property is the process of shape, or what we call the Gestalt. Curiously, there is no English word for the Gestalt, the form of the organism, or the form of a tissue, or of organs, of course. So this word is used similarity in English. The Gestalt is also a process, the process of development, but it also changes constantly throughout life. The attempt to reduce the Gestalt to genetic information has not been conclusive. There is so much regulation of genes and so much of epigenetic processing that the connection between genes and shape are still an enigma. The overall Gestalt can be seen as a system level, in the same way as a system level may be the level of the organs, and they also have a Gestalt. So it may have an own reality, but of course in interdependence with all the other levels. But this shows that it is still valuable to study the Gestalt scientifically. It is not an outdated science, as some claim. Many of the classical research areas in morphology, paleontology, and so on have been pushed back by the dominance of reductionistic thinking, and I think this is a misguided development. Morphology, for example, zoological morphology, has still something to contribute to science. Another property is time autonomy. If one looks at physiological processes in their sequence, then it becomes apparent that they all proceed in a very specific temporal order. They have a very precise temporal order, a time order: cell cycle, growth and maturation, heart rate, respiration, and so on. I want to call this the time autonomy. Why time autonomy? Because they are self-generated time structures. These are just some examples of such processes. They are self-generated time structures, generated in very precise and very detailed organizations. It is the activity, the agency of the organism itself that generates this time autonomy. And every process in time has a specific self-generated duration. They are not simply triggered by the environment that is well known in chronobiology today. And these time processes are typically oscillating, so they run in rhythms. And this is described in great detail in chronobiology today, for example, here in the circadian rhythm. But there are also rhythms of completely different frequencies, which are below the day rhythm or even above it. And what is interesting is that these overlap. And this results in a multi-layered, quite complicated, multi-layered system of oscillations of different levels. It describes the rhythms of different orders. And actually, the challenge is to think this in one together. They are simultaneous, they are interdependent. So there's a constant rhythmicity on different levels. And this is what I want to call time autonomy. And here's another interesting thing. One example, one very short example out of chronobiology. When it was recognized that organisms have an internal circadian rhythm, people began to look for a central organ that would trigger this rhythm, a kind of internal clock. In this search, a region in the anterior hypothalamus has been identified, the so-called suprachiasmatic nucleus, which was considered to be the seat of the internal clock, a central oscillator, a central organizator of the rhythm. And this linear causal model was in the background of research. And through intensive research, however, it now became apparent that it is more about interactions, again, about interdependencies. First of all, most tissues and cells can oscillate. So there are peripheral oscillators. The central oscillator has more of a coordinating function. It receives inputs from all these participating oscillatory systems. And in addition, it also acts back on the photoreceptors. So we can say these oscillation systems are integrated, are interdependent systems. There is a concurrency between these oscillators, and this again makes a system as I described before. Now, due to constraints of time, I can only briefly mention some further properties. One is sensitivity and affectability, of course. Sensitivity is a central principle, of course, in organisms. And the more an organism builds up autonomy, its complexity within the evolution, the more they form contact and exchange with the environment. Another property is subjective experience. This already begins with single-cell organisms. They experience themselves in relation to their environment, and this evolves into complex systems of mammals and birds, for example, and this may be the basic principle to generate consciousness. Then the ability to evolve is another property, of course. Science has learned now, of course, that the world of organisms is in a constant long-term change with all this evolution. But to understand this principle and to describe the evolutionary history of organisms is one thing. To understand the factors that are driving the process is still under discussion. Over the last 2 decades, it has become clear that random variation with selection alone is not enough to understand evolution. A wide range of other factors that have evolutionary significance are currently being discussed. These include, just to mention some short examples, changes during individual development, or this Evo-Devo discussion, the intrinsic activity of organisms, again, the agency within evolution. Is it possible, that's a question, is it possible that the activity of the organism contributes to evolution? Or the mediation of genetic material by viruses, and many more. Just a few examples. Here's not the time to discuss these factors, but in general, the organismic view of the living will lead to new considerations of this in this regard, I think. So the organismic view may contribute to also to new understandings of evolution. If we see the organism as an integrated whole, the system as a whole needs to be considered in the evolutionary process. I myself have suggested that the autonomy capacity of organism has changed in evolution, and that this is an essential aspect of major transitions. And this I summarized in this book on the origin of autonomy. Many aspects of these considerations are summarized on the website, The Third Way of Evolution, and who is interested can have a look at these discussions there, these aspects that are presented there. Growth and development is a principle we see in organisms, of course, again. But it is basically a very interesting property. Why really is it necessary that organisms go again and again through a process of reconstruction? We are used to that. That's natural, somehow very natural. But what is the background of it? One can even say there is no present static organism. Every organism is only a part of the continuous process of its development. Which one is really the frog? The tadpole, the egg cell, the young frog, or the adult one? In any case, we are looking at a snapshot out of the process. So there is constantly creative reconstruction of organisms with all these changes that are possible. And possibly evolution is only possible because there is always this reconstruction with small changes in the process. Which one is really the butterfly? Everything we see is only a part of such an ongoing process, and this is also true for the human being. And the process is activity, a constant activity. Another point is environmental interrelationships, of course. There is a complex environmental interrelationship for every organism. And today it is increasingly under discussion that organisms do not just adapt to their environment, as we have been told since decades now. They also construct the environment in a profound manner. There is a multi-level concurrency between the organism and its environment. I'm just making very short points on a very broad discussion. I'm aware on this. And the last point, reproduction and death. This is again an interesting topic. I can only briefly suggest that death processes are part of life as such and are part of these properties life exhibits. In this sense, death is not the opposite of life, but rather part of it. This especially becomes clear when we regard the process of apoptosis in a single organism, in a multicellular organism, the so-called programmed cell death. In multicellular organisms, there is a regular generation and degeneration of cells. And basically, this also is the case in ecosystems, of course. Without the principle of death, there could not be a new life. Ecosystems function by balancing, constantly balancing these processes. Goethe, to cite him at one point, said, "Nature's spectacle is always new because she always creates a new audience. Life is her most beautiful invention, and death is her artifice to have abundant life." Now, the challenge is to think these principles, these properties together, to get them into one picture. That's not easy. These are all specific properties of living beings, and I think they can't be reduced only to physical and chemical properties. And it is appropriate to take them as a starting point of research. This is done in many cases, of course. This research is running, but there is still some tendency to work more in this linear cause and effect change I showed in my start when I began. So the challenge is to see them in their concurrency, their interdependence. They exist at the same time. I think that a more appropriate understanding of the organism in a sense like this would change our whole attribute, our whole attitude towards life itself. How we think about life, how we treat life, how we do agriculture and medicine is dependent on this notion. And this is a crucial moment, I think, for the development of science that supports environmental protection and the protection of the earth as a whole. It can be the basis for a new partnership with nature, really to think about life in an organismic way, to take these principles, these properties serious, and to take them as starting points of research. So we need to think in context, in interdependencies, in multi-layered structures of autonomy, of networks, of sensible processuality, and so on. And the wonderful thing is that we can think the world animate, and this also includes a spiritual dimension, and that will be my last point. Why spiritual? I will try to describe this in a few sentences. If we take these specific characteristics of living things seriously, it becomes clear that all of this is based on a high degree of order, a certain degree of order. But order, this organization, is not only material in itself. It can therefore not be experienced mechanistically or materialistically. Instead, we study its organization, its order, its content, or its intelligence, as Michael Levins called it. I think that's the same thing. We are looking therefore at the same point. And we are increasingly able to think about this organization, about this intelligence life has, to mentally recreate it. So if we really engage with these phenomena, we can mentally follow the inner organization of these processes. Humans have emerged from this organizational structures through evolution. So we came out of evolution. We are part of this evolutionary process. And this means we are not strangers to it, but we are parts of it. Then our consciousness, our thinking, our intelligence cannot be something external or foreign to nature. Our thinking, the cognitive side of our experience, and also our abilities to experience nature emotionally and empathically have also emerged from this nature. In this respect, we are participants in it, not external spectators. Therefore, I think that modern philosophical constructivism is wrong. It assumes that we are confronted with nature as strangers and that we can only form more or less accurate thoughts about it that help us to orient ourselves within it. But we are participants. And this is not only the case on a biological level in that we need oxygen and food from nature, but we are participants also with our thoughts and feelings. We can think within nature, so to speak. And thus, we can also mentally be participants in this process of nature. However, this requires us to form appropriate ways of thinking, not alien models that are imposed on nature. And this thinking within nature, I think, has a spiritual dimension. And the good thing is that we can do science with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosslenbroich. So, if there are any questions from the audience members, please feel free to ask. I have questions myself. I'll go last, though. And Dr. Shapiro, please welcome. We're very happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So I'll go ahead and ask, well, first let's try to unshare the screen.
Yeah.
It should be from the Zoom, from within Zoom, if you go back down to where the green arrow is in the center, it should allow you to stop screen share.
I don't see it.
Oh, okay, let's,
Here. Here's something. Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
So my first question for you, Dr. Rosslenbroich, Gestalt, you mentioned Gestalt.
Yeah.
And the study of Gestalt, the scientific study of Gestalt. Now, did you imply that zoological morphology is the study of Gestalt in a scientific way, or do you think there's some difference? And what would that difference look like?
No, I think that is it. If I look at the literature, for example, from the last decades of the 19th century, people did a lot of comparative work on Gestalt, on morphology, or even going right into the 20th century, of course. And there were people who were really able to read in the comparative morphology. And this is done today. This is still done today, of course. There are some people who are doing this, but what I experienced is within the universities, these institutes are not taken so much serious as biochemical or molecular biology things or points of work. And so there might be some imbalance between these studies and these possibilities to study on a certain system level. And possibly there would be more potential to continue these studies in the conventional sense. So I don't think about something really new, but we had in Germany, some very interesting figures in the 1960s and 70s who really studied the forms, the Gestalt so intensive in the comparison, and it would be interesting to continue this research, but this mostly has been replaced by molecular biology. So it exists, but there is some sort of one-sidedness, and that's what I mean.
Just for reference, would you be willing, are you able to just name some of the individuals from Germany who worked on Gestalt, as you were just mentioning?
Yeah, Professor Stark, for example, that was a leading figure in Germany, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it referenced in your book, perhaps, some of these figures?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in the chapter about the Gestalt, there's references. Yeah.
Okay. So now the reason I'm interested in the Gestalt is because it seems that the organismic form is both flexible and it's not flexible. Actually, so pulling from Professor Bell's talk, he made a very nice point that there's organizational closure coupled with thermodynamic openness. So the organizational closure is there in such a way that it can't be breached in a very traumatic way, otherwise death occurs. But nonetheless, it's flexible enough for adaptation to occur, in relation with the environment. So my personal question is I'm very skeptical about macroevolution, about speciation, about how adaptation, of course, is there, but the adaptation seems to reinforce the integrity of the gestalt, which is in a very simplistic way, the fish doesn't become a lizard before our eyes, right? The lizard can change many parts of itself to adapt to the environment, but the point of that is not to be a loose boundary between species. It's to reinforce the integrity of the species. The adaptation is to reinforce that integrity. So does Gestalt science would this be a way to explore how organismic form is, it fights to maintain an integrity? It's not to say that the organism changes to a whole new species by just invoking a lot of time. Do you see where I'm trying to?
Yeah, perhaps. Well, we would need now a concrete example that would be easier to talk about this. I didn't prepare this here. But basically, there are several factors involved. The activity of the organism, what I called agency, the tendency of any organism to establish or keep its autonomy, its integrity, of course. And this mixes with adaptation to get around in the environment and um, to be able to survive within the environment. And these are different factors that are involved. And we have a wonderful example here in our institute where we are studying the evolution of early mammals. So there are a lot of fossils today from what formerly has been called reptile-like or mammal-like reptiles. That's the term, mammal-like reptiles. Early mammals that evolve into the mammalian organization in the late Permian times and during the up to the first mammals in the when they emerge after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So there is a long evolution for several million years, and my colleague Susanna Kümel follows these trends, and she can find trends and certain directions which the different organisms take, and in different lineages, they undergo changes, slow changes, and these changes sometimes go more into the direction of autonomy capacities, more movement capacities, being able to run more in the environment, for example, and others go more into the direction of adaptation or one-sidedness and all these things. And on every level there is a spectrum of the exchange between these organisms and the environment, or getting around within the environment. And it's very interesting to see how the lineages change that generate the next level of organization towards the mammalian organization. So to compare these different lineages and to see how they are specializing or whether they are not so much specializing, but become generalists, become more flexible, more general within their in the environment and things like this. So we would need some pictures now to understand this, but to see what organisms are doing there is very complicated, and this is a part of the organization and of the Gestalt, how they use their legs, how big they are, how they move within the environment and all these things. And the Gestalt is experimenting somehow within the environment. And that's very interesting to study these things on the level of the Gestalt. And that's basically what I mean. I don't know whether this can be understood now with these words, but I would need some pictures though to show this. It's extremely interesting.
No, I very much appreciate your response. I just think there's a lot to talk about, a lot to learn, to have some kind of from my own side, to comprehend how to approach that field in a more scientific way without just speculating.
Yeah.
So appreciate your answer, and that your institute is working on. I know your book on autonomy is about, in a summary way, how evolution is leading to freedom from reliance on nature to some capacity, right?
Yeah.
So
Yes, I think through all these processes, really very concrete evolutionary processes from different levels, organisms were able to generate possibilities, to generate more opportunities within the environment. And to generate opportunities, that's what I mean with autonomy and with degrees of freedom. To have opportunities, to generate larger nervous systems, brains, and things like this. A large brain gives the new opportunities for environmental relation and things like this. So there is some trajectory in evolution to generate these space of opportunities and of autonomy. That's what I try to follow in this book.
thank you very much. Are there any other questions for Dr. Rosslenbroich? Technically, we still have about 30 minutes in this session. So if there aren't any other questions at this time, then we can move on to Dr. Shapiro's presentation. And if any questions come up, please utilize the chat feature. And then after Dr. Shapiro's presentation, we do have this space. We've set aside an hour and a half to have an interdisciplinary dialogue amongst any of the speakers who would like to participate in that. And we have some questions set up already. So we hope that that might be a very open-minded and productive opportunity for an exchange of very rich ideas here.